Welcome to the Investor Agent Podcast. I'm Steve Seymour, your host, where we help transform the human mindset from scarcity and lack to abundance and wealth, one conversation at a time. Steve Seymour here with the Investor Agent Podcast. Today I have Bryce Stewart on. Bryce, thanks for being on today.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be on here. I'm looking forward to it.
So Bryce has his book here. It's on Amazon. We'll talk about it a little more later, but thank you for being on. We always like having an author as well as an investor on.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's called House Hackers, A Guide to the Galaxy. It's kind of a blueprint of my investing journey from being a W-2 teacher to eventually retiring from my W-2 job and then scaling the business.
And I know house hacking is a big topic, so we'll touch on that for sure. I really want to go back to the beginning. What got Bryce interested in real estate? So how did this all come about?
Yeah, I'll say this. I got a degree in college in elementary education, and coming out of college, I think a lot of people get into this rut. I assumed that my 19-year-old self choosing that major had basically written my economic future indelibly, engraved it in stone. So, what was I going to...
Just saw one path.
Exactly. Was I going to go back and get a degree in finance?
Right.
No, I wasn't going to go to college a second time. So I assumed,
not going through that again.
that was the route.
Yeah.
I graduated college, moved back to Westchester, which is where I'm from, and was living with my parents, right? That's probably familiar to a lot of people recently out of college. My dad was the kind of guy who, because I had a college degree and I started working a job, he was charging me $300 a month in rent.
Smart man.
Yeah, to live in my high school bedroom.
You're probably grateful for that now,
yeah, right. He was like, you eat a ton of food. So that was some of it.
He's teaching you principles too,
yeah,
though.
Exactly right. So I started working a job in Westchester, and I met a guy who was also 23 years old. So I was 23. A guy that I worked with was also 23 years old. He asked me, where do you live? And I was like, I live with my parents.
Yeah.
And I asked him, where do you live? And he said, my college roommate and I bought a 4-unit apartment building in Norristown. He's like, we live together in one of the units and we rent the other 3 out. And I did not even understand the words that he was saying. It just was not even anything that was in my mind.
Don't know what you don't know.
Exactly. I went to a school that was a 4-year dormitory housing, so I didn't even rent an apartment when I was in college. And I grew up mostly in suburbia. My dad was a Presbyterian minister, so I always felt like a poor kid in more wealthy areas because the clergy doesn't tend to make a lot of buck, at least not on this side of the grave.
I can relate. Different story, but I can relate.
So because I had lived in suburbia, I had no conception of even really what apartments were. I knew that Chandler and Joey lived in an apartment on Friends, and I knew that Jerry Seinfeld lived in an apartment, and I literally thought only large companies can own apartments. So it didn't make sense to me when this kid said that he and his
he's
college roommate owned an
like,
apartment building. So I was like, my response was, what do you mean? Like, you guys own an apartment? Like, you two own it? He's like, yeah, dude. And I'm like, isn't there a really high mortgage for something like that? And he said, well, it's not low, but the mortgage is covered by the rents that we take from the other 3 units. And I was smart enough to be
light bulb.
Yeah, right. I was like, well, what about the real estate taxes and the insurance? He's like, dude, that gets covered by the other 3 rents. And in my mind, I'm like,
yeah. You got the hamster wheel going.
I'm cynical enough that I'm like, there's something wrong with this plan. I got to poke a hole in this guy's bubble.
Fear, the lack.
So I'm like, well, I bet the water bill or the electric bill is really high or the cable bill. And he goes, I don't know about the other 3 units because they all have their own meters with the public utility companies. He's like, but if I'm honest, we pay our utility bills with the rents from the other 3 units.
So they're living for free.
And I was like, wait, hold on a minute. I'm paying $300 a month to live in my freaking high school bedroom and you guys are living there for free?
Yeah.
And he's like, almost, dude, it also puts $200 a month in our pocket for spending money. So
as you became more and more skeptical, it got better and better.
I was angry.
Yeah.
I was pissed off because no one had told me that you could make money from something besides your job.
You didn't learn that in high school?
No. Not in high school. And look, I had parents who were good people.
Right.
They were financially responsible people. but they did not have a blueprint for
They might not have
investing.
ever even thought of that.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. It was not, I mean, when you're a Presbyterian minister, there's a lot of other stuff that's on the front of your brain, and that gets the most attention.
Rightfully so.
Yeah. So that was a huge moment for me. And I cornered that poor guy in the lunchroom and was like, you need to tell me, like, who told you that you could even do this? Like, this was not an option that was presented to me. And the next day he brought in the book for me, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which I devoured in like a day and a half.
The Investor Bible.
Right, yeah. Which it's actually not, look, it's a good
kickoff.
It's a good
mindset.
Yes,
right?
It's a good 30,000 foot view and mindset shift. It doesn't have terrific granular advice.
Yeah.
But I'll say that any book with granular advice is going to age out and be obsolete after a while. So you got to have the 30,000 foot view. But for me, that was really the first kind of light bulb moment was, oh, wait a minute. People can make money from something besides their job.
Which that is a big piece of it, right?
Yeah.
Because you could look at the granular, but if you don't have the mindset shift,
right,
then it doesn't feel possible.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, this is good for someone else, but not me. Or the water bill is going to be too high, or your cynicism will kick in. And then when it clicks in, so what was the biggest takeaway for your mindset shift out of Rich Dad, Poor Dad? Because I'd love to hear it in your own words.
So the mindset shift was gradual, right? Because you're trying to break down all that you've ever known from a lifetime of living. And when you're 23, you already know everything. So who wants to go back and scrape stuff down to the foundation and start over again?
Right.
You know, I was smart. I got decent grades in high school. I graduated magna cum laude from a pretty good university. So I was smart. And sometimes that's a barrier, is that you're unwilling to admit that there's something you did not already know or had not already figured out. And so you just write it off. You make up excuses. And because you're smart, you rationalize away opportunities that, look, if you're listening to this podcast, I guarantee there are dumber people than you who are killing it.
Yep.
And part of the reason that they're killing it is because they're too dumb to even quantify the risk of what they're doing.
They're just going for it.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Which on a certain level.
So it sounds like it brought a certain level of self-awareness too.
Eventually, yes. Eventually, yes. It pricked the bubble initially. Like anybody, it takes time for that to kind of percolate through the entire being. And for me, it took years, because guess what? No one walks up and hands you a 4-unit apartment building.
No.
Even after you understand that that's a possibility. Yeah. So,
well, let's fast forward into that.
Yeah. I sat on it for a while. Didn't do anything. And then my wife's from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour north of Westchester in the Lehigh Valley, which when I lived in Westchester, I was so myopic. I didn't understand why anybody would live in the Lehigh Valley. I was like, what do you do up there? Milk cows or something? Turns out it's the 3rd largest MSA in the state, behind Greater Philly and Greater Pittsburgh. It has its own robust local economy. It's growing insanely fast. It's proximate to North Jersey, New York, and then Philly. It's at a logistics hub for a lot of trucking routes. And there's a lot going on there just as its own economy. But I didn't know that at the time. I couldn't fathom it, whatever. So fast forward, my wife and I get married in 2006. We bought a luxury 1-bedroom condominium that a developer had retrofitted in an old Bethlehem steel building.
Okay.
And my father-in-law was an insurance agent, and he was insuring the builder. And so his proposition to us was that he could get us an early pre-construction contract on this condo. So I thought that was immediate equity, and it seemed like a good idea to start with. And for a while, it was a good idea. So we lived there from 2006 to 2008, and my brain going into it was at a point where I was like, well, we'll live here for 2 years as our primary residence, and then we'll be able to sell it in 2 years and not have any capital gains taxes, because that's the rule if you reside in two. So by 2008, though, we were pregnant with my first daughter, and the market was upside down, especially the condo market was upside down. And so a condo that we had purchased at $155 and still owed around $150 on, like, comparable units were selling for $85,000 or $90,000. So we were completely underwater. And then it wasn't until then that I started doing the math. We're pregnant. It's a 1-bedroom. We want to move out somewhere where we have more space. So I'm like, okay.
I like how you took responsibility, said we're pregnant.
Yeah, right. Exactly. She's pregnant. Yeah.
Nice move. In case she listens.
Exactly. But I honestly, going into it, I hadn't done the math on the way in of what we would be able to rent it out for. So when we were looking to move, I'm like, well, okay, we'll rent it out. And I realized our monthly drag was like $1,400.
Okay.
That's principal, interest, taxes, insurance, and then an HOA fee at this place. And the most I was going to be able to rent the place out for was like $1,100 for a 1-bedroom in Bethlehem.
Negative cash flow.
So negative $300,
equity.
right.
You're feeling real smart at that point, right?
Yeah. And I was a teacher, so not making a ton of money. My wife was working for the Chamber of Commerce with nonprofit. So neither of us killing it in the income game. And we had just treated our housing costs like one more bill, right? And it was all fun and games while we were working 2 jobs, 2 salaries, 2 mouths to feed. But now we're looking at, having a kid and we need to move and we can't without losing money. So the short explanation to that is we did rent it out. We took a $300 per month loss and we had to go and find an apartment that was renting for much less. Thank God, we found an $850 per month apartment. Not really nice, but honestly a pretty good deal for where we were at. So that brought our monthly housing costs down and it kind of absorbed,
offset a little bit.
Exactly. It absorbed some of the $300 loss.
Yeah.
It was a 3rd floor walk up in downtown Bethlehem.
Let me ask you, are you glad you kept the condo?
At the time it was that or foreclose.
Right.
I saw foreclosure as death. And so I didn't want to do it. We held that condo for 13 years and it lost money almost every month of those 13 years. And then finally sold it 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. I actually wish I hadn't sold it 2 or 3 years ago. I could have done a lot better.
Sold it now, right?
Yeah.
Or kept it?
Yeah. So we rented a 3rd floor walk-up apartment. My wife's job thankfully let her keep most of her hours so that she was able to do it with an infant. And the apartment was only a few blocks from where she worked. And then when my daughter was 4 months old, I came home from school. I walk up the 2 sets of steps, open my front door, and my wife is in the middle of the living room floor, bawling her eyes out. My daughter's in the crib, bawling her eyes out. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what's the matter? Are you okay? And my wife says, I'm pregnant again. So I was like, ready to, turn it all in. Cause now I'm like, well, we can't stay in this 2-bedroom apartment, which by the way, that's not true. You totally can with 2 small kids. Right. But I was like, now we got to move somewhere else. My wife's going to have to get rid of all of her hours because she's going to have 2 infants. And I'm still, I'm looking at the teacher's compensation schedule and I'm like, this is insane. We just went from 2 salaries and 2 mouths to feed to 4 mouths to feed on 1 salary, and it's a teacher's salary. So it was dire. So that was the moment when I started thinking back to the book that I'd read, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, that guy. And I was like, well, if anybody needs to live for free right now, it's me and my pregnant wife and my infant daughter. So this was 2008, late 2008. I didn't even know what I was doing, honestly. I'd never, even the purchase of the condo, I had never really made, my father-in-law kind of handed us off to the sales agent. So I had never even really been a buyer. So driving to school, maybe a week or 2 after that, I pull up to a red light. I look over and I see a for sale sign out in front of a row home that has 2 mailboxes on the front porch and 3 power meters on the side of the building. And I'm like, I bet that means that it's a duplex. So on my way home,
good indicator.
Yeah, right. Yeah. On my way home,
I use that today.
Exactly right. Yeah, if you want to drive for dollars, that's a good way to do it. So I pull up, I write down the phone number, and I call the agent and say, "Hey, is this I think it might be called a multifamily property?" And she's like, "Yes, it is." So I'm like, "I want to do a showing." So I go home and tell my wife. My wife is like, "You're insane. We're already underwater on a property. You want to try to buy another property? We're losing money every month. We're underwater. You're nuts." But I did it anyway. And my wife actually came with me when we did the showing. And we go into the place and it smells like cats and cigarettes and piss and
opportunity.
Yeah,
Smell of opportunity.
Smells like cats that maybe smoke themselves. And tenants were weird. There was a kid running around with a shirt on and nothing else, like Winnie the Pooh.
Do you remember the numbers on the deal? Can you share them? People like, and yeah, we'll make it up. No one will know.
We walked away from that, but the important thing is it put me on an auto email list for that agent with a multifamily. Yeah. So like 2 weeks later, we had an email of a place that looks better. We go to it. It's gorgeous. The guy who bought it sheriff's sale and then renovated it very nicely. It was a 3-story row home, second and third floor combined as like a 3-bedroom apartment. And then the first floor, separate entrance, separate meters, separate locks, everything, a 1-bedroom apartment. So the numbers on that were, it was selling for $175,000. The rates at that time, when we looked at getting into it, it was going to be about a $1,200 per month payment.
That's great.
PITI, yep. And the apartment on the first floor was bringing in $600 a month in rent. So the way I looked at it was, okay, when we were renting, we're paying $850 per month for our housing part, and then this
sounds like a no-brainer.
Yeah, brought it down to $600. So we used an FHA loan to get into that property because I was rubbing together maybe $5,000 or $6,000. I even had to borrow, I think, $3,000 from my in-laws just to close and pay the 3.5%. Yeah. But once we got in there, our housing costs dropped to $600 per month, or our kick-in did.
It's amazing.
It was awesome. And then a year later, maybe 18 months later, we refinanced out of the FHA loan and into a conventional owner-occupant loan. Not strictly conventional. We found a local bank that actually had a killer loan program. They did 90% loan to value with no PMI. It was a portfolio lender, so it was not Fannie or Freddie conforming or anything like that. But no PMI, 90% loan to value, extremely competitive rate. The only quote unquote downside was that it was a 15-year balloon on a 30-year amortization.
Okay.
So,
but it lowered your payment.
But it lowered our payment, and we weren't going to be there for 15 years.
Right.
So functionally, that's the same as getting a 30-year fix.
Yeah.
And it made for great cash flow. And it also meant that we were able to refinance after a year and a half and basically have the 10% as built equity into the property. And because had it been an 80%, we would have had to kick in to try to get the loan.
To get rid of the mortgage insurance.
The important part for your listeners is this, if they're in a similar stage of life, is the FHA, if your long-term goal is to be an investor, FHA is a terrific initial way to grab a hold of an asset using a really small amount of money. When I coach people today, I explain, this is, I think, the best investment available to the average person walking around in the United States today.
I would agree with you because it's, when you think about, you can leverage 96.5%.
Yeah.
And then you can get up to a 6% seller's assist depending on the deal.
Right. And that's unheard of. I mean, you're using a couple $1,000s to gain control of a multi-$100,000 asset, right? Which you're entitled to the full appreciation of that asset. You're entitled to the full cash flows of that asset. It's a government subsidized down payment assistance basically that is just not available. Yeah. And you're grabbing what's functionally long-term an investment grade asset. Yeah. And there's no other.
You could leave the debt on there, or you could refinance it like you did. I mean, there's a lot of options.
So, I mean, look, I know a lot of people listening to this, maybe your experience, but don't lose sight of this fact that if you're instructing somebody else or just thinking long-term yourself, if you want $175,000 of Apple stock, you need $175,000 of cash to go get that. I mean, there's margin stuff you can do, but for the average person, that's what you need.
You can't leverage anything else the way you can leverage real estate.
And so if you put in, like we did, $4, $5, $6,000 as part of this down payment, the cash investment is a couple $1,000, $6,000, $7,000. And for us, within a year even, the appreciation of the asset, maybe let's call it 3 or 4% appreciation over, was already 100% return on investment for the money that we made, not even including the cash flows that we were getting.
Yeah, so if you think about it, right, like cash on cash return, it's through the roof.
Through the roof, exactly. Yeah. And this is something that the government is making available to the average person and saying, go do this. We have a program for it.
I think this is a big piece because a lot of times on podcasts like this, people talk about, I have 35 properties or something. And then it's like, oh, well, that's unrealistic. But guess what? Start with one.
Right.
And there's financing available, and you have to talk with a local realtor, figure out, find out who's a good mortgage broker or loan officer in your area, what kind of products are available.
Yeah.
See what your options are.
100%. I mean, that changed my life, just that deal. I mean, it's not the best deal in the world. I wasn't living for free like my friend when I was 23, but for us at that stage of life,
it kind of is though, because it's almost like infinite return.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Within a year, you have your money back in equity and cash flow. And
yep. I still have the place. It's actually one of my flagship apartments at this point.
Nice.
It's a gorgeous place, but that was the first step that we took. The story now. It was kind of out of desperation.
Yeah.
But it was desperation informed by just a little aha moment. I didn't understand any of the granular pieces going into it, but
let me ask you, were you nervous going forward?
Oh, 100%.
That's another thing that, you just have to realize courage isn't not having fear. It's taking action in the face of fear.
Yeah.
And you have to believe in it. And what helps is knowledge and experience. And if you can bounce ideas off of someone, but yes. you must have had some level of internal faith that it was going to work.
It was driven by desperation. A lot of investors get to that point where the actual big moment, the threshold moment, was when they were terrified. And for us, I mean, we prayed for 3 days before we submitted the offer. I talked to everybody that I knew, and then, not trying to toot my own horn, but a few years later, I was making offers on places sight unseen.
Yeah.
And,
and you're probably not as nervous.
Yeah. It went from
still maybe a little bit each time.
A little, but I realized after going through it that there's plenty of outs that you're not
and you build that muscle and
exactly right. Yeah. And you realize too, that this is key for, look, if you're a real estate agent and you're coaching a buyer, or you yourself are an investor trying to get through this, you got to realize that a lot of the steps up to and including purchasing an investment property, they're not the cliff that you're jumping off of. So okay, for you and I, you make an offer on a place today. Let's say you make a below list offer. Let's say it's a property for $300,000 and you put in an offer at $285,000. Okay. I don't see that as a risky thing to do. You actually putting in that offer, you're not deciding that you want to invest in real estate at that point. You're just making an offer. Then you get a counter at $292,000, okay? Now you actually have a decision to make.
Right.
When that counter offer is sitting on your desk, that's when you decide, am I going to be a real estate investor? Because until that point, you actually don't have a decision to make. You're just talking yourself into the laziness of not making an offer because you're scared, because like a lot of people in life, you want to know what step 5 is going to be before you're willing to take step 1. And what I've learned in my real estate investing career is that there's probably 3 different step 5s. So don't waste your time trying to quantify it right now. Take step 1, especially if it's a zero risk step, and wait and see until the spotlight shines on the next step.
See if you have what it takes for step 2.
Yeah.
But
you probably won't see step 5 until you're on step 4.
An inspection contingency.
Right.
Maybe you have a financing contingency.
Exactly right. That's an analog that actually replays in a lot of areas of life where you're not I'll give you a good example, and this is going to fast forward in terms of expertise here. I have a buddy who read my book. He's worked for a nonprofit since he was out of college, and so he's never had a high salary, no bonuses, no merit pay, no commissions, nothing like that, just nonprofit salary. The one thing that he and his wife did that was good was that they improved the houses that they lived in, and they bought 3 houses. And because they were on a nonprofit salary, they just rolled the equity into each new purchase so that they would have a low mortgage payment that they could cover with their nonprofit salary. Very wise, very smart, and very responsible. So they
turned each one of their primaries into a rental?
No. Oh. They just sold and tax-free moved the equity.
Tax-free, got it.
Yeah. So he reads my book, and this was 2 years ago. He starts asking me questions. They end up with a house that's worth maybe $450,000, that's like a standard kind of suburban house where we're at, 4 bedrooms, that kind of stuff. And their loan is like $120,000.
Oh, wow.
So they have a really low mortgage. Yeah. So he starts asking me in my book, hey, can I, how did you do X, Y? So I'm like, all right, here's what you guys need to do. Go get a home equity line of credit, okay, to make around $200,000 of equity available. And then let's start looking at rental properties. Now, here's the thing. They were initially reluctant because what they told themselves was, we don't know if we want to be landlords. We don't know if there's anything out there that we'd be interested in buying. The market looks thin right now because it was still fairly competitive. And so what I had to tell them was, okay, look, it's going to cost you maybe $50 to $100 through your bank to get the home equity line of credit set up. Sometimes it's free. It's always cheap on your primary. And I'm like, then you have access to $200,000 of liquidity. And I'm like, if you at that point decide you don't want to be real estate investors, there's no obligation to take a draw on that home equity line of credit. You could just let it sit for a year and then tank it, kill it, retire it.
So you kind of eliminate the risk on their first step, which is them getting their access to capital lined up. But if they don't use it, they don't have to.
They were responsible enough that they weren't going to use it for a vacation or a Harley or a boat or something like that. So I'm like, just do that and then we'll talk, because I'm like, what you can't do is see a good deal and then have to scramble to get the HELOC set up. It'll be too late. The deal will disappear on you.
It's very wise advice.
So they did that. They took that step with a no-risk HELOC. They had no obligation to draw on it, and it did not increase their monthly payments at all. And then like 3 weeks later, my buddy was cruising Craigslist, which some people still use.
It works.
He found an old real estate investor who thought Craigslist was the pinnacle of digital,
latest digital advertising avenue.
And he was advertising a property for sale that was like half a mile from my buddy's house, a late 80s, early 90s build townhouse. He wanted 180 for it. And so my buddy's like, hey, I want to go see this property. I was like, I think it's underpriced. I also said, but I'm not going to go into it with you because I don't want the moral culpability of like walking you into a deal if it's a noose or a guillotine. I'm like, so you have to decide right now, be a man. You're going to have to walk through the threshold of that door, both figuratively and actually by yourself, because you'll be the one who has to live with the consequences. So he's fairly handy because he, repaired their houses. He went through it. They ended up he told the guy, he was the only buyer because he was the only one who responded to this Craigslist ad. He said, I'll pay full asking price. He told the guy, this is my first deal. I've never been a real estate investor before. I can transact in cash. So that's exactly what they did. They used the HELOC, took a $179,000 draw, bought in cash, and then luckily, like a month and a half later, it appraised for $205,000. So instant equity. They took a stabilized loan at 80%, which knocked out most of their HELOC balance. Brought it, they paid back down the HELOC, and now the gun is reloaded. He had a little bit of cash, so he actually brought the HELOC back down to zero. So there's a stabilized mortgage on that townhouse. It's cash flowing for maybe $500. Now you have that
asset bringing in cash flow. And you have liquidity again, access to capital.
And the gun is reloaded to go out and do it all over again. So you get to a certain level where you have equity or access to cash or perhaps partners, and it makes it magical because you can transact without needing a bank to drag their feet for 3 or 4 weeks. Some more advice for those of you who are perhaps a little bit farther along and you're not going to do the whole FHA live-in thing. This guy was not going to do what I did, which is my family and I, the duplex thing, we rinsed, lathered, and repeated that a couple of times.
Sure.
We were willing to use our owner occupancy to buy places for a low down payment. But that's not the only way to invest in real estate. There's plenty of people who have done it the way that my buddy did, with a home equity line of credit, or they grabbed capital partners who had no interest in managing the asset itself.
Private lending.
Exactly. So, so those are some of the lessons that I learned. We did the whole, actually after we did the FHA once and found this bank that did like essentially a 10% down payment program, we used that into our next
something good, keep it going.
Because it took PMI out of the calculus for cash flow.
How long did it take you to build up? So you have, how many properties do you currently have under your belt?
I have about $5.5 million in real estate. Our debt's maybe $2.5 million, just over $2.5 million. My portfolio at this point, cash flows about $20,000 a month. That's with a property manager in place. That was a big piece.
That was another question I was going to ask. Self-managed?
That's a piece I just moved in last year. Okay. Because my margins were finally at the point where I was comfortable doing that. And I've learned a lot of lessons in building.
And how many doors did you make that decision?
That is
to bring in property management.
It was actually, I've been at 37 doors for the last year.
Okay.
I was a little higher than that before, but I sold some stuff and restructured. For me, growing my portfolio was always about freedom. So I was heavily biased in what I acquired, that it needed to be easy for me to manage temporarily. And then turns out I've got 32 of my 37 doors are all on the same block.
Oh, that makes it very easy.
Yes, in downtown Bethlehem.
Economy of scale, right?
Exactly.
You have your maintenance people in place.
Yep. So for a while that was, I didn't want to be driving all over the place managing properties, but turns out that's a really good pitch to a potential property manager, is that I'm handing him a portfolio that he doesn't have to drive all over the place to manage. And that means I was able to negotiate a better management fee with the property manager. And actually I'm renting a commercial space to him in one of my buildings.
There you go.
Yeah.
Makes it even easier.
So
almost like on-site.
Exactly. Every time he shows up for work, he is boots on the ground for my properties. You know, he can see when there's a Mountain Dew bottle on somebody's windowsill next to a sidewalk, because it's on a thoroughfare in downtown Bethlehem.
So I know we just went from like house hacking, getting started to like, you know, and so how long did that take you? And what are a few learning lessons along the way? We'll keep it higher level just because we went granular on the house hacking side.
So that duplex purchase was 2009. Our second purchase was 2012. It was actually a 3-unit right next door. And then by 2015, my initial goal was just to make up for my wife having to stay home with our 2, and then eventually 3, and then eventually 4 girls. And when that worked,
kept going up and up.
Exactly. Yeah. Then I was like, all right, enough. When that worked, after our 4th girl, we bought a normal house, like a single detached house. But the cash flows from the at that point 6 units that we owned paid for themselves, and threw off $3,000 a month in net cash flow. And then I bought an affordable house that was maybe $1,500 PITI. And so we were kind of living for free and getting about $1,500 a month in extra net cash flow. It's a very
responsible, realistic way to go about it. And when you have kids and, you know, you don't want to take big risks, but that was like that's like a very achievable, realistic goal for most people if they get into this.
I think so. And here's 2 big lessons, no matter where you are in your journey, that you can take from that. One is this. I was a teacher still at that point, living in this house, having it paid for. And I kind of figured, like, in terms of net cash flow, or my job is that I'm a teacher, but like we can kind of live like I'm a attorney. Maybe. I mean, not a very good attorney, but like, you know,
you have some lifestyle choices. Yeah.
And I can have a wife we had 4 daughters in 5 years. So we needed a COO of our household at home taking care of stuff.
Very valuable to have that opportunity. And it's an amazing opportunity for her and your kids and
100%
the family as a whole.
So just to give as much value as possible to your listeners on this, during that time I was reading a blog called Mr. Money Mustache, which is an insanely good blog, just about financial freedom and about expenses and about the lies and the trap of modern advertising that fool people into shackling themselves to a highly consumptive lifestyle. In many ways, especially when you're building, the choice is between freedom or consumption. And the way I teach it to kids or to high schoolers or people who are just starting is, imagine that you are standing in front of a plowed field. You're a farmer, you're standing in front of a plowed field, and you have a bag of seeds in your hands. And you're hungry, okay? So there's a temptation to reach that hand into the bag and eat the seeds, right? But what is true of every seed that you eat out of the seed bag?
One less crop.
Exactly. It doesn't go into the ground and it can't grow. So rule number 1, I think, of financial freedom is don't eat out of the seed bag. Or if you have to survive, eat as little as possible out of the seed bag. The rest of it you need to put in the ground so that you can harvest later on.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, it's easy to think about. But I told that to my roofer.
Yeah.
And he was like, dude, I think about that every month now when I'm doing my budget and stuff. And for him, now he's a landlord.
Yeah, and it takes discipline.
Absolutely.
You know, as you start, I just created, $50,000 in equity. Maybe I could go buy a car or a boat or a Harley or whatever.
Exactly.
And you have to say, well, I could, or I could go buy 2 more properties.
Yes.
And what will that give me?
Exactly.
And you have to make those decisions.
Here's the next lesson. When American pioneers were heading west during the developmental stages of our nation, they often went in wagon trains. So they'd load up Conestoga wagons and they'd go in a train, maybe 15, 20, 30 wagons long. Whenever they felt threatened by, let's say, native tribes or something like that, they would do something called circle the wagons, which means they would draw all the wagons into a circle so that they had a defensive position to shoot guns from or whatever. So that's now it's an idiom. When you say circle the wagons, it means get into a defensive position. Mode. Yeah. And when I was a teacher still and sitting in our house and had, property coming in, it was really easy for me to pat myself on the back, say that worked, to also say, well, that worked. It was risky. That risk is done. I'm not sure I want to re-extend or get into more risk. I already have a good life. I have a good job. I have health insurance coverage. I should just sit tight. I'm making more money net than most teachers are. But the problem with circling the wagons is as long as they're in a circle, you never make it to California. Mm. And so at some point you have to say, look, there's a risk to reestablishing and continuing to go. And I had to get to that point when I was sitting there with that house this was not my end goal. My end goal was to work myself out of a W-2 job and have complete passive income. And so I kept investing. I kept looking at deals. For a while, I had a lull where we were saving up money and we're, taking care of a family and that kind of stuff. That was fine, but I still had my ear to the ground. I was still underwriting deals on the basically back of a napkin, pretty easy with small multifamily. Yeah. And I still had a couple real estate agents sending me, multifamily listings, and they knew too if they caught a hold of something before it went to market to send it to me if possible.
And I think there is a time to, go buy. There's a time to hold, and there's a time to sell. Really, never should sell in my opinion, but unless it's a losing property.
Right.
But as long as it's an asset producing cash flow.
Well, and remember, even if you're not adequately recapitalized, and even if you have to kind of coach yourself into the same thing we discussed before, there's no commitment to invest until after you get a counteroffer that you've signed. So be that jerk who offers below list. If you are an agent, you know how to submit an offer. If you can find an agent that doesn't mind sending you a DocuSign, do that.
Because and I'm sure during those times you were just more conservative, right? Yeah. Like when you're like in growth mode versus preservation mode.
Yeah, and I lost a lot of deals too. Yeah, I had stuff that I offered on that we didn't get, that we were so disappointed we didn't get. But you know what? That's a muscle that will atrophy if you're not using it. So stay in the game and realize that a lot of the game is not the transaction. It's the relationships. It's the network. It's even your that you have a pre-approval that's up to date that you'll be able to send to a seller.
What is your purchasing power?
Exactly.
Staying on top of your true purchasing power, your liquidity, your access to capital, your tax strategies.
Shop capital partners. If you're in a spot, the time to go find a capital partner is not when you have a deal in front of you. It's when there's no deals on the horizon, you're bored, you're circling the wagons, like you said, or you're recapitalizing, because it's going to take a while for them to trust your expertise, your underwriting. Yep. It may take them a while to have money ready to move around. So, it's easier to stay ready than to get ready.
And then your priorities change too. Like you build up your portfolio, and I'm guessing, tell me if I'm wrong, but your priorities change from growth to preserving, as well as efficiency and tax strategies. And then, you want to I'm sure you still want to grow, as most investors do, but there's maybe less of a drive to grow less of a drive to grow really fast versus grow strategically smart,
right?
Without changing your lifestyle within your management scope. You become, it's just like anything, you just refine it over time.
Yeah. You become less willing to take on pains in the butt, even if there's money attached to them.
Yep.
That's kind of the stage where I'm in, where over this past year, I was like, all right, I want more income, but no additional chores. For me, that's been a big rubric.
That's a great spot to be.
Yeah. How do I gain income without gaining chores? So another thing that I've done over the last, 5-6 years since I retired was I prioritized maximizing the cash flow for everything that I already owned. So some of you may be in this spot where I'll give you a great example. Last year, I had a duplex in downtown Bethlehem that had shared gas forced air heat. Okay, so the thermostat was in the shared hallway. There's no way to subdivide that cost. There's only,
Sounds like the landlord's paying for it.
Yeah, so I was paying for gas, and when I looked back over in the summer, I looked back over the previous year's gas bills, and it was like $1,800, maybe between $1,600 and $1,800. And even in the off months where I wasn't paying for heat, there's like a $35
minimum
fee.
charge,
Just like a customer fee that I'm like, what the heck? I have to pay this too. So I looked at it, and it's forced air, furnace in the basement. I called my HVAC contractor. I'm like, what would it take to seal off all of the ductwork to the first floor and put in ductless mini splits that run off of the first floor tenant's electric bill, and then move the second floor tenants, the gas line for the furnace over to their gas meter so that they pay for their heat and the first floor tenant pays for their heat, and I get to terminate that meter and that account for gas. So the guy, I've had him service my units for a while. He did a double-headed ductless mini split, which are like air conditioners and heaters.
Yep.
So running off a single compressor, but 2 units. And then he put in some supplemental baseboard heaters in like the bathroom and the kitchen where we weren't getting the heat blown. So all totaled $4,500. I got kind of a little bit of a deal because I worked so much with him. But that $4,500 investment shaves off an $1,700 or $1,800 yearly cost, which this year probably would have been more because commodity pricing is higher.
Yeah, gas isn't going down.
Yeah, when you're already a landlord, the options that you have, the investment options that you have available to you are manifold. And in my case, let's say I just have $4,500 in cash, which I did, and I'm looking, how do I invest this? There's a temptation to start looking outside of the portfolio that you already own and say like, oh, should I throw this into low-cost index funds or whatever? Or should I throw it into, maybe this is part of a down payment on another property? But in reality, that's an investment, and it is a real estate investment. It's a micro investment, right? Because a lot of times we think it has to be a new acquisition.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's very smart.
Yeah,
and you're getting probably 20 some percent return.
Well, let's see, 1,800 to 45. That's close to 40%. It's above 40% ROI. Now here's the real kicker. One, that is as compared to another investment. Okay, any other investment that I had made with that $4,500 is going to introduce additional risk, or it's going to introduce additional chores. Right? You buy another property, now you have another set of gutters, you have another roof, you have another basement, you have toilets, you have another tenants.
Maximize what you already have.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a superior investment because the month after we were done installing it, I now have no more chores than I had beforehand. Same number of tenants.
A brand new heater too.
Brand new heater, and I'm making more money off of my existing portfolio.
Yep.
So I renegotiated the leases with the tenants, told them, hey, if you want to stay, I didn't bump their base rent very much, but I said, you'll be self-responsible for your heat this upcoming year. So they both stayed, they opted to renew. So in actuality, that's a direct, that's more income coming to me off of that investment without introducing
and that building's worth more.
Now, yeah, that's the other thing. I spent the cash, but as you know, now it's a duplex, so valuation is in some ways comp heavy. Yeah. But I found most even residential appraisers, they do give some credit for things like that. Heat that's divided.
Sure. Well, and if an investor was going to ever buy it, they're going to look at
exactly
it.
Right. So now you could argue I didn't even really spend the $4,500.
No,
I
actually just moved it around.
Exactly. I converted cash into equity in a property. Yep. And actually, because of the ROI on it, I killed an $1,800 per annum cost. So it's
also a tax deferred.
And exactly. So my equity bump was probably higher than $4,500 because now the cost structure for the building is better. The net operating income is higher. Mm-hmm. And as you said,
your basis.
It
was a little bit of depreciation, not much. But
this was one of those items that you could accelerate the depreciation on. Yeah. So it was a tax write-off. Okay, this is an insane return on investment that's available to people who already own real estate. Things that improve your existing property, and my bias has been toward that always. Instead of going out and finding new headaches to freak out on. I've always wanted more profit out of the units that I already have because that means less chores. It did mean less chores for me. Now it means
it's a lot of wisdom, and a lot of people are so focused on just what's next, and they're not looking behind them. Right. The efficiency of what's happening.
Let's go one more direction.
I'm guilty of that as well.
Yeah.
So
let's go this direction with it. If you have 100 doors and you're cash flowing $100 per door per month, that's $10,000 per month, right? Until rents drop. Now you could go out of business. You could go broke. I would rather have 30 doors making $300 a month and only clear $9,000 and actually sleep well at night.
Yeah.
Because a $300 per door profit can absorb a market correction and not put you out of business. That's why each property that I've owned, I've pursued greater and greater margins because profit margins double as safety margins in a down market.
Yeah. And that's hence why you weren't buying as much, because the valuations are going up with low cost of capital over the past couple of years, and just staying diligent and conservative like most smart investors have been.
Exactly. And think about it this way too. If you go to property management like I did, that's 100 in the theoretical scenario, 100 doors that you're asking somebody to manage is going to be an overall greater absolute expense than the expense of managing 30 doors.
Yep.
So you've hogtied yourself if you've gone for razor slim margins in the name of scaling, that now maybe you can't buy anymore, you can't find really good deals, you can't find equity, and you're really worried that you're going to, rents are going to drop.
Kind of like any business, you have to have some margin, and if it gets too thin and you're going volume based, it's more risky.
Yeah. So I think that leads into, for people who are don't know if this is the direction you want to go. This year, I made my first LP investment in a larger syndication deal in the name of gaining more income without gaining more chores. I went in as a limited partner to this was a $73 million purchase in Texas, nearly brand new asset, 350 doors. So we bought straight from the developer. And the reason I'm saying this is because if you're an agent of smaller properties, if you've only ever done small multifamily, it actually gets simpler as you go into larger multifamily, as long as you're not one of the GPs. But the one metric that counts really heavily is the metric you and I were just discussing. So that duplex where I drove up the net operating income is a great primer for really the only numbers that matter when you're dealing in higher unit counts.
How can you increase the bottom line?
Exactly. And I found that I hope this is valuable to anybody in your audience who ends up being a GP or ends up standing in front of the country club crowd and is trying to get them to invest in a deal. You've got a dentist or a doctor or somebody who wants to give you passive funds. I've found most syndicators go about the education of it the wrong way. I'll tell that from my perspective, the right way to go about it is this. Do not speak the word cap rate to anybody who's newer into the business, because they're not going to understand what you're talking about. It's not going to make sense to them. And it's irrelevant because cap rate is based on total asset value, and what you're asking for is equity that's going in. So cap rate is not going to tailor to their numbers. Here's what you explain to them. What you say is, in general, in any given market, commercial real estate, so anything 5 units and above, even if they're all residential units, it trades at some multiple of its net operating income. So for instance, in California, right now, the average would be about 20 times the net operating income of the asset. So that means if you have an asset in California that's delivering $1 million, so this is after all the costs are paid,
right?
Everything except for the debt service. So the real estate taxes, the property management, the utilities, all this stuff, no snow in California, but all that stuff, when you're done to make it nice and clean, let's say it throws off $1 million in income. Well, in California, that asset could sell for $20 million. In general, that's what the market demands. And it means if something cleared $10 million a year, you could sell that for, $200 million. So what you got to understand then is if you're a syndicator and you say to people, look, this market will deliver 20 times the net operating income, what you say is, I've learned to be really good at boosting the net operating income of an asset, either by driving the cost down or by driving the revenues up. And what your investors need to understand is, for every dollar that you drive up the net operating income, they make $20 on the multiple. Yep. So if you're able to take an asset that was delivering $1 million per year net operating income, and either through renovations or through submetering water or through anything else, you can make that 1.1. Well, that's a $2 million equity bump in the value of the asset. And every investor, every limited partner who's in that gets the full value of that equity bump, or the waterfall split of that equity bump. So it's a magic number in real estate to be able to do that, is because you have an asset that you can crank that lever. Now, around where I'm at, it's not a 20x, it's probably closer to a 12x. But look, that means if I'm able to do what I did with that property, okay, get a $1,800 per year improvement in net operating income, that basically would get multiplied by 12 in terms of increased equity value.
And that's really how the syndicators make it work with the value add. And you're talking going from a 5 cap to a 6 cap is a big difference in terms of that valuation.
Yeah. Like
now we're in a totally different market where who knows, where cap rates could change a little bit.
Like any lever, it goes both ways and it can hit you in the chin.
Right. Cost of capital. So if you leverage in the wrong direction, but
right. Yeah. As long as you know that going in and you've got your debt structured so that you've got an exit cap that's realistic, you still in general gain the added efficiencies of the net operating income, and there's still constricted supply. So you may see people still willing to pay a cap rate even as interest rates go at a higher margin than what the cap rates would.
Yeah. A lot of people are anticipating still rent growth and all that. So
yeah, we may have that with record employment, et cetera. It may go that direction.
I do want to, just in the nature of time, talk a little bit about your book.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're not going to go through the whole thing.
No.
But a couple main points. Why would someone want to read this?
Yeah.
Let's share a little bit about your book.
It's a perfect primer for somebody who's never even thought about real estate investing and is that current 23-year-old, me that didn't have any idea about what was supposed to happen. It's perfect because it's a blueprint for how I went from that first duplex to eventually getting enough cash flow to retire from my W-2 job. And it's perfect if you're an agent and you're looking for a good handout for potential clients who are looking at small multifamily, because it's going to give them a happy story, a good ending from beginning to end, which is how we did it.
So it sounds like there's almost like a case study in the sense where you really share what it took to get started as well as scale up.
Yep. It's an easy read. It's my story. And then at the end of each chapter is the lessons that we took from that sort of chapter of life of like, oh, okay, we didn't know this before. Now we understand. Turns out PITI isn't the only expense. There's stuff like roofs and sewer lines and vacancy repair. I go through all of that. And even with that, it was still the best investment of my life. And I have another book that I'm working on right now, which is going to be called Landlord's Guide to the Galaxy, which is kind of like Act 2 from when I went from retiring from my job to tripling the value of the portfolio. And then eventually Investor's Guide to the Galaxy.
There you go.
But one at a time here. House Hacker's Guide to the Galaxy is this one.
Bryce, we appreciate you being on today. Lots of wise words here. Is there any last tips, tricks, words of wisdom you'd like to leave anyone with?
I have a couple $100,000 in cash that I decided to put in a high yield savings account because it's FDIC insured. I'm getting about 4% and it's immediately liquid if I see a deal. So that hasn't always been true in the career of investors. Right, keeping stuff in cash was bad. I don't think it's a bad choice right now to make 4% on your money and then be ready to jump on whatever deals come up.
There you go. Be conservative, but the liquidity, that's great.
Yeah, right.
Well, thank you again. Appreciate you being on.
Absolutely.
Thank you for tuning in to the Investor Agent Podcast today. We hope you found it valuable. Please tune in weekly at theinvestoragents.com.